Jeff Auk, Executive Director of the Muskegon Conservation District and Chair of the White Lake Public Advisory Council.
And I'm Rich O'Neill. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources.
So to briefly summarize kind of the historical habitat issues around the lake, there are kind of two main areas that we were looking at. One was historical impacts related to the lumbering era, and then the impacts from the industrial era. So in both cases, debris was left along the shoreline, but I think more importantly is that in both White Lake and Muskegon Lake, is because of those activities, the shoreline was shifted lakeward, so there was a lot of fill that went into lake that were traditionally wetlands. And so looking at those areas to restore the wetlands, to restore habitat that was lost during those two periods.
There have been quite a few studies in the past 15 to 20 years, research studies that have shown that as development has increased over the years, we have lost a lot of the shoreline habitat in particular, both for residential and industrial type development. It really doesn't matter, but you've lost your buffer zones along the edge, your wooded buffer zones, and your aquatic vegetation, and there's really good evidence showing that it's caused decreases in many of the habitat components and also in the fisheries and wildlife when those losses occur. So we know, like, for instance, we did a survey on White Lake in 2007, and a couple of the things that we measure is we measure the amount of wood cover that's in a lake, and we know that, for instance, the wood cover in White Lake is averaged about 19 logs per mile, or pieces of wood per mile. And the studies that have been done in undeveloped lakes show that the amount of wood cover in those lakes ranges between 500 to 1,500 pieces of wood per mile. So there's a pretty significant, very, very significant difference there. The other thing that's one thing, and then there's other things that go along with development. That's just kind of an example. But when you look at the fisheries of White Lake, the White Lake and Muskegon Lake, these Drone River mouth lakes that we have, are very, very rich in fish and wildlife because they're connected to Lake Michigan and because they have a river upstream. So we have all this really big diversity there. So what has affected the fisheries of White Lake isn't just confined to White Lake, but it's also affected by the Lake Michigan fisheries, and we've had a lot of changes in fish species and things like that. Some of the fish that we have lost in Muskegon Lake are, for instance, muskellunge. There's one species that probably was lost here, Great Lakes muskellunge. We're going to try to rebuild that population eventually. Another species is white bass, which were very abundant here. We have a few of those present now. We do have a fairly good population that was reestablished in Lake Makatawa down south, and we hope that could progress down the road. But overall, we're seeing both, like for instance, in White Lake and in Lake Michigan, even because of the invasive species and the habitat changes and all those kinds of things, fish production is probably lower than it historically was. So we don't have like the same fish complex here, and we probably have lower fish production. Now, can we help that? We can help that, of course, with habitat. The other thing that's important about White Lake is it's also part of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands. So it's important to the Great Lakes fisheries also. We're working with some of the wildlife biologists as what they found, for instance, on inland lakes and lakes like White Lake, is that what's happened is that the bird communities, for instance, have changed completely because of the deforestation and that occurs there. They've changed from one kind of a bird complex to another, so that's something that's changed anyway.
Yeah, and I would probably add to that, as part of the restoration project, is ongoing monitoring program, marsh monitoring program, to look at both impacts to amphibians, so frogs and toads, but then also looking at the impacts to bird species. So specifically trying to address what will be the long-term benefits to those marsh-related species. So we'll probably get a handle on that in the next 5 to 10 years here and see the benefits that are going to come out of this.
Tell us what a drowned rivermouth lake is.
Well, they're kind of a special lake that's defined by us. Because we have certain regulations, but what they are, they're lakes like Muskegon Lake and White Lake, where you've got a river system that joins with Lake Michigan, and then that lake at one time was just probably a fairly shallow channel that went from, for instance, White Lake out to Lake Michigan, that went across the dunes there. But of course, we've dug shipping channels there now, so it's a more permanent channel. But so that they're actually defined. I mean, they're actually named. We gave them the name Drowned Rivermouth Lakes, and we actually designate those because they have certain regulations on them. But that's basically what they are. They're the lakes that have connecting rivers upstream that go into Lake Michigan or one of the other Great Lakes.
Do they have any unique habitat characteristics?
I would say they do. I mean, they have different types of wetland complexes that you find there because of the nature of the lake backing up from the river system. So it's not a direct outlet to the Great Lakes, in this case, Lake Michigan. So some coastal wetlands that are unique to those areas. I think if we look at both systems, Muskegon and White Lake, part of that has been altered because of the highway system, so acting as dams, kind of capturing some of the natural sedimentation and wetland development downstream. So that's affected the areas as well, but I think they do have some special features. One of the intents of the White Lake Habitat Project was to focus on some priority areas around the system, and this was looking at lots of different data sets that have been collected over the past 20, 25 years and importing that into a GIS system and then building a model that ranks the sites of most importance. And our office did that about 10 years ago and developed a map that shows the different areas, red being the highest priority and then green being the lowest. And I say that the other areas or habitat around the lake is still important to protect and to restore, but these were what were considered the highest priority sites. So then once we had those sites designated, looking for funding to do restoration and long-term protection of those sites. The initial project was looking at 7 sites. At the end of the day here, we had 10 sites that we worked on around the lake. So significant impact on lineal feet of shoreline, acres of wetland that were restored. So a fairly large and intensive project.
What do you anticipate will be the benefits as far as increased fish and wildlife populations?
I guess in general terms, we've seen some immediate benefits from those projects. So most notably, bird species that are using the sites more readily. I think the long-term benefit here is we're trying to restore the habitat so that we have increased areas for rearing of young, for breeding, both in the water and then along the water's edge. And you may not see those changes in the near future because it takes a while for populations to kind of catch up to the impacts. And I always kind of say with our habitat restoration projects, you may see some immediate benefits, but a lot of times that's species that are already there using those sites, whether it's fisheries, fish moving into an area because now there's structure there. I kind of always joke that one of the things that I'll be well known for in this project is throwing these large trees into the system, and instantly we have seen wildlife using those sites great blue herons, green herons. Have several pictures of turtles, 50 or more in this one section that are using the logs within a couple days after installing them. One of the main intents of the project was to kind of remove or restore some of the historical damages, so that may have included removing hardened shoreline, concrete debris. There was a lot of sand castings that were found around the edge of the lake, lumbering debris that was in the area. So removing that material, but also trying to recreate some of those wetland zones that were within the lake itself, but then also adding structure in. And I'm not sure if Rich will talk about it, but one of the things that in developing this project is Rich and a colleague put together a report that talked about conservation guidelines for Michigan lakes and associated natural resources, and kind of using that as a model to kind of look at each of these sites. So adding in structure, how to soften the shoreline, then putting in certain plant materials that are native to the area that benefits not only fish and wildlife, but are also aesthetically pleasing, provide structure. So looking at each site in that way and trying to pull together a site design.
Do you want to add to that, Rich?
I did want to back up just a little bit. You asked about seeing what kind of benefits, and a lot of people want to see. I mean, and it's kind of good. I mean, the birds and the turtles, and you can see fish moving under these structures. That's kind of good. But like for overall fish production, and those things are kind of difficult to prove. So that's why we use other studies to do it. And we have those kinds of studies done in northern Michigan and Wisconsin, where we don't have lakes, where you can actually look at gradations of different lake development in lakes, and different. And they've actually removed wood from lakes completely and measured the fish responses and things like that. So, but the other thing you have to remember here on these lakes is we've been in developing these lakes and doing all kinds of different things, changes to them, altering the resources and that for over 150 years. So you can't expect to go in and do a couple things and restore that to the condition. It's going to take a period of time to do that, and it's going to take more work. I mean, White Lake I would say, is not as degraded as Muskegon Lake, certainly, because Muskegon had a lot more industrialization on it, but it is pretty heavily developed still, and so it's going to take some time to do that, and that's what we're trying to do. It's a slow process in recovering. Trying to restore resources, rehabilitate them.
So we may not expect to see the historical fishery back, or although maybe some species, but a healthy population of in a variety of fish.
Everything, yeah, and it's not just the fish; it's the whole community. It's like, and we're working on the shorelines, and in the literal zone of a lake is the most productive part of the lake. It's where you have all your vegetation, and then the shoreline ecotone, if you want to call it that. If you have your wood buffers there, you have your wood falling in, you have your leaves falling in, you have different species, turtles and things that move up and down the shoreline. It's also very important to filtration for nutrients, that kind of control. So those are all important factors that will take a long time to work on and to help in the recovery. So we kind of focus on like the littoral zone, but then you get into the deep zones, and you can start adding wood somewhat to that area. But the littoral zone is a real productive zone that where most of your fish production occurs.
A lot of times people have a vision of a lake as a clear lake with no vegetation, and you're able to swim and wade and sandy soils and boating. And what's the difference? I mean, what do we need to be looking at as far as a healthy lake for White Lake?
Well, yeah, we call that the swimming pool effect. So probably everybody's heard that before. So everybody wants a Lake Michigan beach in front of their house, but that's not what most lakes are. They've got organic sediments, they've got vegetation in the lake, and things like that. But everybody, and they certainly don't have green lawns right down to the lake with fertilizer going in and things like that. A good example of that is this is the publication that Jeff was talking about that we did, and you can get this on the web. I'll give you the web address. You can download it from our library. But we took a photograph of a lake. It's an inland lake in Michigan that we were working on, and it has a wooded area on the shore with vegetation near the edge and rushes growing out into the water. And then immediately next door to that, there's a house with a green lawn right down to the edge. And you can see the shoreline eroding back into the lawn. As soon as you removed all that vegetation along the shoreline, that dampening effect that it gives to waves and things like that, it started to eat away at the shoreline. And so then immediately everybody wants to go in and put a seawall in or a rock riprap or something hard in the shoreline, which is not good either. So it's it's a real obvious thing that when you start really going around and looking. And White Lake, in the survey, the other thing that we do, another good indicator of how development can affect lakes is actually how many houses or dwellings are on a lake. So studies have shown, so on White Lake we've had about 29 per mile. And what the studies have shown is that at levels of two dwellings per mile, you start to see effect on the wood cover, aquatic vegetation, fish populations, amphibians are very sensitive in the fish and bird communities. And then when you get to like 5 or 6 dwellings per mile, you see effects already in all of those different components that have been measured. So, and we're like at least 5 to 6 times that on White Lake. And a lot of other lakes in Michigan we have even more than that. So it's a good indicator of, because when a person buys a piece of property or develops it, it completely changes the whole face of that. Not everyone does that, but most people do, And the other thing that's happened is this has happened again over, especially since the early 1900s through present day. We go back. We actually have in our files it tells you, well, there were 5 cottages and a couple of houses on this lake. Well, now when you go back and you count them, there's 30 or 40 or 50 of them there, so, and that's happened slowly over time, and nobody really notices, they kind of go to a lake, and this is kind of what the lake looks like, and we're just going to do a little bit. So it's been a slow change, and nobody's really recognized, It's very difficult to even go to a lake around here and find a natural shoreline. The only place usually when I go take a photograph, I go to Blue Lake and take a picture of from the north to the south, where we're looking at where the scout camp is. And that's really got a natural shoreline. In dealing with this issue, you're not dealing with there's not one property owner. There's lots of property owners, and everybody has their own idea, and they have their own needs and what they want to have on their property. So just in general, we tried to come up with some guidelines, and they said, well, what we'd like to see is you preserve a certain amount of that property, or return it to more of a natural condition, and leave a portion of that, say like 25% of it, where you can have your beach area, your picnic table on that, but restore buffer strips in the other parts so you've got good infiltration, water, and take out the runoff. And you're providing some habitat for amphibians. You're providing some wood to allow and leaf litter to fall back in the lake, those types of things. So. And it's easier for somebody with a large property width to do that, I think, than with a small. And what we see more is more subdividing and more subdividing. So you've only got people who got 100 foot of their lot and they want to use the whole thing, so it gets more difficult to do that. So those are kind of the issues. It's a difficult issue to deal with. So.
Can you explain what a buffer strip is?
Yeah, I will. So buffer strip is basically an area that you leave natural or restore as natural, and our office, the Conservation District, in working with landowners, has used that same number of 25%. If we can focus on their activities, or kind of a more manicured area, and 25%, then the remaining 75% being in a naturalized state. And there's lots of studies that have looked at the width of that buffer strip, and obviously the wider it is from the water edge up into the property, the better it is for habitat. And there's a number again that we always use. If you can put in a 100-foot buffer, it's would be a great benefit, because there's some calculations that show leading up to that number, you you see dramatic increases in population as the bigger the number gets, and then over 100, yes, there are increases, but it kind of plateaus. So trying to look at that 100-foot area. The other thing I was going to mention, kind of help people visualize, is we always, or it might be a lot easier to look at a forest ecosystem and say whether it's healthy or not. And kind of the different components, most people would say, okay, I realize in a forest system there's the ground cover, there's kind of an understory, and there's a canopy, there's dead and dying material in there. And the same thing applies to the aquatic environment, is making sure you have those different types of vegetation that are in different levels. So whether it's submergent or emergent, but also having that dead and decaying material in there. So whether that's large woody debris or decaying leaves. So having all those natural components, both in the upland and the aquatic area, are very important to the ecosystem health.
So we know in Michigan that we've lost 80% of our wetlands, so the way they've classified them. And so that has had pretty significant changes in what's occurred. So, and wetlands are, I mean, I don't know of any biologist that doesn't agree wetlands are extremely important to the health of our streams and lakes. I mean, just the water quality aspects, not the fish and wildlife aspects.
Yeah, and even from the water quality standpoint, the wetlands are always compared to the kidneys of the aquatic system. So they're what helps to keep the water clean and healthy. So even if your only interest is in water quality and not necessarily the habitat components, well, wetlands are important from that side. From a habitat side, they're the most productive areas for fish and wildlife. So making sure that we protect those. If people are interested in fishing and wildlife viewing, then those are the most important areas. So protecting and restoring those are, I think, a major thing that we should be looking at around the lake systems.
And that's the other thing about these drowned rivermouth lakes, is because they have this pretty large river system, that basically, that whole upland wetland system probably was all White Lake at one time, and it's slowly, the sediment has filled it in and it's turned into wetlands and that, but it's a good component to have because it does help a lot in filtering and that. And I think Jeff and some other people now are trying to work on some issues up there where some of those wetlands have been disconnected from the floodplain and that, and they're trying to restore those connections, old celery fields and things like that, so that's a good thing. But there is that's a different type of wetland. I mean, a lot of that is dry, semi-dry right now, so it's good. They're producing different types of things. But when you get up there, I mean, those are good areas for certain kinds of fish to use for spawning and cover and food. Where the wetlands along White Lake provide a little different kind of cover. The wetlands and littoral zone areas around White Lake provide different for the other types of fish. So the whole complex is I think a good example is yellow perch, because that's a species that migrates freely between White Lake and in Lake Michigan, and we have populations of yellow perch in both. And for instance, if you go out there right now on White Lake, I mean, if you went out there this fall, there were large numbers of people fishing for yellow perch. A lot of those perch were moving in from Lake Michigan. But we also know that perch spawn in our drowned rivermouth lake. The concentrations of young yellow perch are very high in the lakes. And we also know that a lot of those fish migrate out into Lake Michigan. So there's an exchange there. So that kind of shows you the coastal wetland aspect of that. And also yellow perch do move up into those upper marshes up there to spawn also. So
Can you both explain the problem of invasive species in White Lake?
Well, I would say there's multiple problems with invasive species in White Lake, both in the aquatics and in the upland areas. And, our office has recently been trying to address one of the major ones, Phragmites along the shoreline, which has, in some areas, eastern part of the states has basically taken over the wetland system. 90% of the cover is now Phragmites. So it's fairly new to the White Lake system, so trying to get a handle on that, working with landowners. looks like this next year we'll try to do a lake-wide implementation to get it under control. And in most cases, the issue with invasive species are that so they're not native to the area, they don't have natural predators, and they basically take over the system, either forming not a complete monoculture, but basically dominating so that the other native species can't be part of the system, and then that impacts all the other species that are there. Probably the major one, I'm sure Rich will touch on in the aquatics, is Eurasian water milfoil. And it's, again, something we've been looking at, but it's a little tougher to control exotics versus land-based. And I think that also goes to, one of the questions a lot of people say, well, we already have enough weeds in the lake. And in most cases, what they're talking about is Eurasian water milfoil.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the other species, if it's a healthy habitat, there may be a large number of them, but they fill different areas of that forest canopy, so to speak. So they're not clogging motors, they're not impacting fishing. So that's a concern.
Yeah, that's probably true. Eurasian milfoil is a kind of a different subject than Phragmites. I've been dealing with that for a long time. We have it all over Michigan in our inland lakes, and we have it in White Lake. And if you go on White Lake and you go into outside the Narrows into the big basin of the lake, there's Eurasian water milfoil out there, but it's mixed in pretty well with native fish community or native plant community there. See the same thing on Muskegon Lake. It's not really taking over like it can in some situations. So really the best thing to do with that is leave it alone. On the other hand, when you get up into the Narrows area where you've got a lot of sediment deposit, it's fairly shallow, you can get these, milfoil has probably overtaken a lot of the other plants, and there's a number of reasons. I mean, in that case, what our recommendations are in here is to control, because with Eurasian water milfoil, it's a control. It's not you're not going. There's no known way to exterminate Eurasian water milfoil. It hasn't happened anywhere that I know of. So you have to keep in mind that it's going to be a long-term effort, and you have to do it in the right way. And what we recommend is that if you're going to do control in the proper locations, that you do it with the least effect on native plants, which is a big issue in managing milfoil, because what most people do is they either because they have to or because they want to, they also kill the native plants along with the milfoil, which leads to more milfoil. A lot of times if you do the wrong control program, you can actually enhance the levels of milfoil in the lake because you're removing the native plants. So right now, I mean, White Lake, I don't really see Eurasian water milfoil as a big issue. There was a fish study, a larval fish study on Muskegon Lake, and everybody says, well, it doesn't provide as good habitat as our native plants, and that's probably true. I mean, if we could just get rid of Eurasian milfoil, that'd be great, but we can't. But in that study, they found that the highest densities of yellow perch that were found in the entire study were found in a large Eurasian water milfoil bed in the middle of the lake. So they do. Milfoil does provide cover and food for fish. So you got to be careful. Phragmites, for instance, like Jeff was saying, it's kind of a completely different situation. Phragmites is on land; it's easier to get to, and you can usually deal with that without affecting the natives very much. So,
can you talk about the other land-based invasives that are being controlled as part of the Habitat Restoration Project? Purple loosestrife, invasive honeysuckle, and canary reedgrass.
Yeah, so those were all prevalent, so the invasives. Purple loosestrife was fairly dominant in the wetland system 10 years ago, has kind of reached a peak and has, I would say, more of a sustainable level now. You still see it, but not the huge patches that you used to in the system. And that's partially from some of the native insect species now becoming predators of that plant and using it for larval food and things like that. But it was an issue at some sites, so controlling that reed canary grass, which is fairly common, especially in areas along roadways where it's used to stabilize slopes and things like that, so it was an issue. Honeysuckle, there's fairly prevalent all throughout the system. So in each of those cases, at the restoration sites, is getting those species out of the upland system and then replacing them with natives as well. So for honeysuckle, it was like cutting and treating, pulling out stumps, and then going back and retreating. And at each of these sites, it's going to be kind of an ongoing effort, because whether you're talking about Phragmites or honeysuckle, it's a 3 to 5 year program of continuing to try to address it just to get it under control. And then after that, it's a little bit easier, but they're thriving because of their natural history, and so it's not a one-time thing.
What can shoreline property residents do to help out to get rid of or control invasive plants along the shoreline?
I think the first thing is to gain some knowledge on correctly identifying the plants. So in each case, there's natives that are comparable to these species. So appropriately identifying first and getting some knowledge, and then if they are able to and want to do treatment in those areas, make sure that you do it correctly. As Rich mentioned, for Eurasian water milfoil, doing certain activities can actually exacerbate the problem. You can spread milfoil much quicker than you can control it. Same thing with Phragmites. If you do certain things, you can stimulate Phragmites to grow, and next year it's twice as strong. So educating yourself, I think, is key. And then if you're looking for support, try to talk with one of the natural resource agencies to see if there's a way to help control it if you don't have the knowledge or the ability to do it.
What would be the natural resource agencies that White Lake area shoreline residents would look to?
Can contact our office, so the Muskegon Conservation District. We do a lot of site consultation with private landowners, at least getting them the information. And in certain cases, we have specialized programs. Like I said, for this next year, we're going to be doing a lake-wide Phragmites project, where we have some additional matching funds to work with landowners. Probably talking with the DNR to at least gain some information for aquatic invasives. And each of the private restoration sites, so where the restoration work was completed, conservation easements were placed on that work, so permanently protected. Now, putting a conservation easement doesn't mean that it's open to the public, but what it means is it's basically permanently protected for the benefit of the public. Occidental Chemical was one of the larger sites, about 14 acres going into a conservation easement there, so it doesn't mean 14 acres open to the public, but so those will be permanently protected. Then working with the public landowners, so City of Whitehall and City of Montague, to write long-term management plans. Those were a little bit different scenarios because both cities have charter park designations for those areas. So realizing that the long-term benefit was in working with them to manage them rather than simply placing an easement on that property. We had a couple sites complaints of odor, and we kind of discovered that it wasn't related to the restoration work. It was related to dead fish being thrown into those areas because they provide good cover to hide things like that. I don't see the concern with mosquito populations. These are, again, natural wetland conditions that we're providing. So as they continue to develop and they become a kind of a restored ecosystem, so you're going to have the birds there to eat the insects. And recreational use, I would say, has been dramatically increased. There has been some concern as far as redesign of some of the public areas, as far as gaining access or having ready access to the sites. And I think a lot of that will change as the sites mature. It's a matter of getting used to the new designs. But in most cases, like at the Lion's Den site, we were able to add additional parking as part of the project, so actually increasing the recreational access. And City of Montague, again, working with the city to kind of increase the public benefit and not completely restricting it. So I think part of that is just perception, and that will change as people get used to the change in design. A lot of times what we try to do is not only do the habitat benefit, but in the recreational side of it is in some cases create a master plan for each of the sites, so integrating in walking paths, adding different areas where people can get down to the water edge itself. So taking that into account on the causeway, City of Whitehall side, putting stairways down there, putting in little fishing platform areas, whether for fishing or just to look at what's down there. So trying to draw people into those areas and use them more.
Yeah, that's a kind of a quality of life issue. I think that we see that nowadays, and we're always trying to promote that. But there's also an economic side to this. I just wanted to mention the one way that we measure that type of thing, and we were not able to do it on White Lake. We were just about ready to do what we call a creel survey, which measures how much angler use there is on a particular lake. But we were able to do it in Muskegon Lake in summer of 2002 and winter 2003, and what we found there was that in Muskegon Lake, the annual economic value of that fishery is over $500,000 a year or so. Or excuse me, over $1.2 million a year. So, which is even more than the Great Lakes fishery that we have for salmon off the port. That only includes what was going on in Muskegon Lake. And the fisheries in White Lake and Muskegon Lake are almost identical. So White Lake's a little smaller, but we have similar things. So people really use it, and I think it did show that local residents probably were the bulk, probably at least 60% or a little bit more of the users of the lake there. So, and I think anybody who just drives out around during the winter can see, how many people are actually out using the lake now. So, with the accesses that Jeff are putting in for shore fishing are just great, because there's a lot of people that don't have boats, and the more shore access we can get is really good.
Will the Habitat Project, still have the benefits that are anticipated even though lake levels are at record lows?
They will, and we tried to integrate some of that in the initial designs, not realizing that we would reach the record lows, but kind of putting a little bit as far as plant species selection and where we placed coconut logs or core logs for erosion control. So trying to place those appropriately for changing water conditions. So they will definitely add benefit, because the plant species was planted in a fairly wide zone, so not only within the water but also up on the shoreline. So as the water transitions back and forth, those species will also kind of transition back and forth. And part of that is simply a matter of changing the slope of shorelines. A lot of the shorelines were fairly vertical or a fairly steep slope, in which case those species can't transition quick enough. But expanding that slope so that you have, say, the kind of the saturated soil zone, which is now 15 to 20 feet long, where you have multiple species in there, where before was maybe only a foot wide. So they'll see some changes. Even with water levels dropping, the native plants that we establish will continue to march outward, and then when water comes back up, they'll march back upland. Government funds were used for this. I think, one of the things we were looking at is to address the habitat issues with White Lake. A couple years ago, I jokingly say that if you would have asked me what's going to be the hardest thing to delist for White Lake, I would have said is going to be habitat, because you don't often come across $2 million for habitat work, especially in the extent of looking at seven separate sites. So I think funds were needed to get this work done. I think it's also important to note is that this isn't the end point. We haven't completed all the work we need to. Rich and I continue to talk about projects up in the river, other sites around the lake that we can continue to add large woody debris and restore shoreline. But I think one major project was a hurdle that we needed to get over. As far as using those funds for private property, again, the intent was to base this project on the priority sites. So we had developed this model that ranked the priority sites, public and private. Again, one of the biggest sites being Occidental Chemical, which was a private site, but was important to the lake system. So making sure that we restored habitat that was important for the entire lake, regardless of who the landowner was, because the public reaps the benefit of these sites. That's also why we put the protection on there, so on the private sites that are permanently protected for the public good.
Do you see that changing in the future? Just the people's perception of what is valuable or beautiful or aesthetically pleasing?
I hope that it changes. I mean, we've seen some changes in the past 10 years, especially around White Lake, with getting education out there about what are the benefits of a naturalized shoreline. I think that's helping. But I think as people learn more about why it's important to protect or restore those areas, hopefully we'll see a change. So we'll see.
Yeah, I agree. It's we've only just started talking about this within about the past 10 years or so, really, on some of these issues, really probably 20 years or so. We know development's been an issue, but it's not really been focused on too much. And and we do have people that are very receptive to that. Other people simply don't like it for whatever reason. Waterview is always, you pay more for it and all that type of thing for private property. But again, like Jeff said, once people begin to understand why we're trying to do that and really start looking at things, I think we'll get more converse. And again, this isn't something you're not going to change everybody's view in just a few years. It's going to take quite a while. And I think as it starts to happen and people start to see what it looks like, and you can blend. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't use your property, and but if you're at all resource oriented and want to help in restoring and protecting our resources, then maybe you consider doing those things. So.
And probably just add as a last note there is that we talked about the benefits of a buffer, and so even if people put in a 5 or 10 foot buffer, we'll be able to see the benefits in the long run. So some small changes will really help. And I think once people realize the benefits of maybe why they moved to the lake, the things that they were looking for, having these natural areas along the shoreline is actually one of the keys to why they moved here. Right. And I find it interesting. A lot of people that we interact with talk about wanting to kind of move to the White Lake area because of kind of this not quite up north, but more relaxed kind of resort type area. But then over the years, lots start to change to a more urbanized setting, which is interesting because the reason they moved here was to live in a small community with kind of this naturalized area to interact with.
It's kind of like way back from the 60s, Carole King paved Paradise and put up a parking lot, and that's kind of the way it's developed over the years. So, yeah, maybe not a perfect example, but it's kind of the same theme. You want to be in nature, you want to see it, but do you want to destroy it at the same time? So, or do you want to help it?
The Habitat Project's been a big deal for the White Lake area, ecologically, but also economically. If you could speak to that, but also, what significance does it have, in the Great Lakes? Is this a big deal? I mean, or is this just, something that's important for us?
I guess first to speak about the economics, one of the things that we had done within this project is to try to drive some of the local economy. So, and working on this project is trying to return as much of that money for habitat work back to the community or for use by the community. So we really focused on using as many local contractors as we could, everybody from engineers to the excavators to the landscape companies, and putting not all, but as much of that $2 million back into the local economy here. So a lot of the, not only the contractors that we've worked with, but a lot of the local businesses have kind of thanked us and said we appreciate that, because it does help the system and helps build local businesses. Going back directly back into this system, there was about 40%, so meaning that went directly into staffing, people working in the area, or materials that were purchased in the local area. Total, there was about 80% that was went into the local economy, so that includes local contractor purchasing materials through other local businesses, even though they may have been outsourced to other parts of Michigan or United States. But so 40% direct and probably 80% indirect. So
those are all federal dollars coming back into Michigan, and those are pretty important. These are pretty significant, these two, because these were selected out of there was a lot of competition for these funds, and we were kind of ready for it because of the areas of concern and the public advisory councils and all the work that's been done with all the partners. We were kind of ready for this kind of a thing. We kind of knew, had an idea of what we could do with those monies, and so it was pretty significant. That's significant funding coming in.
I guess the larger basis is, relates to the area of concern designation. So I think both for Muskegon Lake and White Lake, working on these projects to eventually get them removed as an area of concern, I think is of great importance to the Great Lakes. Again, Muskegon County having two of them within our county isn't a great claim to fame, but I think the bigger benefit, not only for the health of the individual lakes, but the health of Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes, I think will be felt for many generations. This is kind of not the end-all, tell-all. There's ongoing work that is going on for not only the lake, but also the White River, so the entire watershed system, to address habitat, nutrient issues. And probably another note to kind of say is, even though we've done this, it doesn't mean that there aren't other issues of habitat within the lake. So there's still a lot that needs to be done. Just because we can say, well, this will remove us from area of concern, doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to do.
Yeah, the delisting does not, from my perspective anyway, there's a lot of work to be done as far as habitat goes in these lakes. So, but it's a start. It's helped a lot. So.